In February 2024, this derelict old building in County Durham hit the national headlines after friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway began a campaign to buy it and restore it in time for the 200th anniversary celebrations of the line in 2025. Why? Because this is Hayington Station, and it's now thought to be the oldest surviving passenger railway station in the entire world. Originally, it was thought to have only been used as a goods storage point and a tavern after the line opened in 1825. In that short interval between steam engines taking to the rails and the concept of passenger stations being developed properly. It was only officially referred to as a passenger station in the late 1830s, but fresh evidence may now suggest that passengers have been waiting at this building since at least 1827. Now, before you go running to the comments section about this claim, bear in mind that there's a lot of ambiguity surrounding records such as these, and that there's an entire video unfolding right before you now that might actually look at some of that. But if Hayington does prove to have been used for a small number of passengers as far back as 1827, then that would technically scoop this building off its perch. This is the famous Liverpool Road Station in Manchester city centre, now part of the Science and Industry Museum. Liverpool Road Station was opened in 1830s, one terminus of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. It closed to passengers in the 1940s, and like Hayington, it closed completely in the 1970s. Now, what distinguishes the two for the coveted title of world's oldest is that Hayington was a notable stopping point along the line that sheltered a handful of people, whereas Liverpool Road was a purpose-built passenger station, complete with a fancy street facade and a ticket office. And like all records caught in the tussle between the Stockton and Darlington and the Liverpool-Manchester Railways, a lot of it comes down to intention. The latter was more of an intentional passenger railway, the former was not. But what often gets forgotten in the melee is that the Liverpool and Manchester, like the Stockton and Darlington, had other railway stations along its length that were in use when they opened. Smaller stations where the intention is less clear. Many of them were mere halts, places for the trains to stop en route, either to pick up a few passengers, small amounts of goods, or more often to take on water. The thing is, neither Hayington Station or Liverpool Road Station are in use today. But some of those smaller places along the Liverpool to Manchester line still are, which opens up a new record. What's the world's oldest passenger station that's still in use? At this point, it's worth pointing out two other railway lines that are much older. The Oystermouth Railway, running 5.5 miles between Swansea and Mumbles, opened in 1807 as the world's first fare-paying passenger railway, and the Middleton Railway over in Leeds, opened as a waggonway as far back as 1758, partly converted to steam power in 1812 and still operates today. Now, first the Oystermouth Railway. It had two purpose-built stations at either end where ticket fares were collected, but they are both now gone. Secondly, the fact is that it was horse-drawn, had open carriages and falls into that grey area between railways and tramways that exists because of the lack of definition around those early days of rail travel. Second, the Middleton Railway was used primarily for goods until as late as the 1960s. When it started taking passengers. So for the purpose of this video, looking at the world's oldest passenger railway stations, we'll have to exclude both of these lines. Well, none of the original buildings from the Stockton and Darlington line are still there and used as stations, so let's look at the other line, starting at its opening in late September 1830. At the opposite end in Liverpool, where Stephenson's famous rocket engine led a procession of trains towards Manchester, the original station at Crown Street is long gone, now a public park. Nearby is Edge Hill Station, which serves as a hub for a lot of the lines leading into the city from the east, including towards Liverpool Lime Street, which quickly replaced Crown Street as the Liverpool terminus of the line in 1836. Now, unfortunately, while old, this Edge Hill only dates back to the same date as Lime Street. The Edge Hill Station in place on the opening day of the line in 1830 was deep inside this cutting, adjacent to Crown Street. But before we go to the next station along, let's jump on the return journey from Manchester back to Liverpool and count down the stations all the way back to Edge Hill. Leaving Manchester, the next station en route in September 1830 was Cross Lane, which survived all the way up until 1963 when it was closed. And then it was wiped away in 1971 when the M602 motorway was constructed. Technically, it didn't appear on the line's timetable until 6 months later, but none of the intermittent stops really did. The opening weeks and months of the line are shrouded in a lot of mystery, with no stops really listed on the opening day, others thought to have been there shortly after, like Cross Lane, but not listed until 1831. And some have changed the name several times, just confusing matters. One that was used even on opening day was Eccles. In 1830 this station would have obviously looked very different, probably nothing more than the most basic of facilities. But George Stephenson did pull one of the engines, the Northumbrian, to a stop here on the actual opening day of the line, pulling no carriages and carrying just the injured MP William Huskisson, who had been crushed beneath a rocket at a stop called Parkside, several miles along the line. Next along the line in 1830 was Bury Lane, later known as Glaisbury and Bury Lane. Like Cross Lane, there's nothing really to show how much this was in use as a stop before March 1831. Although we do know that by the end of the 19th century, it had 2 platforms and a simple wooden booking office. It closed in 1958 and today there's no trace of it left. There was another more substantial original stop called Bolton Junction here. This was later known as Kenyon Junction, where a connection was made to the already existent Bolton and Lee Railway, making this the world's first railway junction between 2 nominally independent railway companies. But it's not there anymore and is in fact private land. What else isn't there anymore is Parkside, the place where engines stopped to take on water and where the Liverpool MP Huskisson met his terrible fate while strolling across the line to speak to other politicians, including the Duke of Wellington. Parkside today exists in the middle of 2 junctions connecting the line to Wigan, but the station closed here in 1878, and the only trace of it is this rather large memorial to Huskisson, erected in 1913 and strangely facing the line itself, making it very hard to see. Not that you've got much of a chance. The land around here is all private, and good luck trying to read all that text through a train window as you whisk past towards Liverpool. But none of these stations and stops exist anymore, and this is a common theme along the entire line, including Collins Green and Lee Green, the latter of which distinguishes itself from the current active station of the same name by being in a completely different place altogether. Newton Lee Willows and Rainhill on either side do still exist, both dating back to the opening of the line, but the latter holding a special place in railway history as being the location of the Great Steam Locomotive Trials, held while the line was still under construction. 11 months prior to opening day, October 1829, the Rainhill Steam Locomotive Trials took place over several days. 10 locomotives entered, 5 were actually able to compete, and only 1, the Rocket, actually finished. The station buildings here date back to the 1860s, but at the far end of the platforms is this wonderful road bridge built over the line. And as you can see, it's got quite an angle on it, this type being known as a skew bridge. And yes, it's the first skew bridge ever built across a railway and is a listed structure. There was another stop at Huyton Quarry, but that's also vanished. Skipping over that, we come to another one that actually still exists, simply named Huyton. Situated in what is today the outskirts of Liverpool's urban sprawl, this once countryside location has remained an active railway station since 1830. And like many of those we've just covered, early stops and stations were little more than places where the line happened to cross a road or a turnpike, and where passengers could get on or off if they chose. Today, Huyton has a handsome station building and 4 platforms, acting as a handy commuter station for heading into the city. All much later additions. This canopy was added in 2010 as part of a £1 million modernisation scheme. Sadly, we've now left the open forests and fields behind, so it's almost impossible to imagine what this place looked like in 1830. It's a little easier with the next one along, Roby. If Huyton is handsome, then Roby is pretty. This is a commuter village that's separate by name only from the greater Liverpool spread, a place of old detached houses and lots of character. In the 1830s, when the line opened, this was the first village the trains would have reached after leaving the town of Liverpool. Though Crown Street and Edge Hill were surrounded by fields and on the very edge of Liverpool as it was, it would have been important to have a stop at the first significant turnpike outside. Perhaps having two significant halls in Roby helped a little, though looking at maps from the early 19th century, the station was clearly little more than a simple concern. Today it's much more an elaborate affair, complete with multiple platforms and a subway. But Roby wasn't the first stop those first trains leaving Liverpool came to in 1830. There was one more, between Roby and Edge Hill. And because of the direction of travel of that first journey, that makes this place the world's oldest surviving railway station, still currently in use. By what was probably only about 15 minutes. Yes, just over 1.5 miles from Roby is Broad Green, what was in 1830 a tiny hamlet betwixt a bunch of halls, and just off a minor turnpike road leading out of Wavertree. On the map you can see how one of the roads crossing the line became the wiggly bit at the end of the M62, where it becomes the A5080 and ducks under the flyover. Broad Green Station is dominated by the motorway here, and there's little to distinguish the place as separate to Liverpool now. It's well and truly been swallowed up. But the station remains. Old photographs show a fairly significant little station next to the old cottages. There are even 4 lines, and space enough for 2 minor stopping lines on the south and 2 on the north. About 100 metres away ran the North Liverpool Extension Line, which opened in 1879 and closed in 1972. Sadly, even George Stephenson couldn't have envisioned such architectural beauty as what remains at the site today. In fact, nothing from the 19th century exists at all, let alone from 1830 when this was probably nothing but a dot on the map. All this was built in the 1970s, including the Jehovah's Witness Hall where the cottages used to be. Although today, even all of this would soon be consigned to the past. The 1970s ticket office building has already gone, exposing the subway, as attempts to modernise it by installing lifts have begun, leaving the site a bit of a mess. It's a station today and it was a stopping point in 1830, but here we come to another grey area. In those early days, as a crossing point or a re-watering point next to the turnpike road, was it actually a station? In fact, what is exactly the definition of a railway station? The first recorded use of the term railway station was in 1836, so that doesn't really help. And if a passenger railway station is somewhere people could get off and on a train, then Broad Green would meet the definition. But so muddy is early railway history at the start of the 19th century, and so informal were stopping points along all the earliest railway lines, that we really don't know. By that definition, then a station could just be a random point along the line where someone once climbed aboard. If there needs to be a building or a simple wooden platform present, then places like Broad Green, Eccles, etc. wouldn't be the first because they got such things a few years later. And a lot of the history at this time about halts and stops relies on word of mouth or intermittent newspaper cuttings, but if we go off solid hard evidence, then we have to look at the historical record, which is whether places were timetabled. Like properly timetabled. And by that definition, Broad Green and its siblings along the Liverpool to Manchester Railway do become the oldest. And so a visit to the world's oldest continuously operating passenger railway station is a bit strange. It's a mid-20th century modernist blandfest encapsulated in a contemporary building site. It's smaller than it was in its heyday. It's got a noisy neighbour, the motorway, which became rail transport's biggest nemesis in the 20th century. It's the least historic looking historic site I think I've ever seen. But I think that's also what I like about it. The record Broad Green holds is a bit more specific than just world's oldest station, and it holds it on a technicality by virtue of being slightly closer to Edge Hill than its neighbour Roby. And looking at it, you wouldn't think that this would be carving a place for itself in the history books, those that bother to notice it. It's absurd. But that absurdity makes it funny and makes it special. And to see this pretty average looking 2-platform station in the middle of a nowhere in the shadow of a concrete Goliath, and think that this was part of history being made, well, that's kind of wonderful.